Far away from the noise of the world, beyond the busy ports and tourist routes, there was a small island that hardly showed up on any map. It was the kind of place you could fly over 100 times and never notice. Surrounded by deep blue water and thick fog, it sat quietly in the middle of nowhere. Fishermen from nearby villages used to talk about it, always with a strange look in their eyes. Some said the island was cursed, others said it was protected by something unseen. But no one had set foot there in years. No one remembered the last time a boat had gone close to its shores. The island looked peaceful from a distance, covered in green trees and soft white sand, but it carried a kind of silence that didn't feel natural. Even birds rarely flew over it. People joked that the island didn't like visitors, and maybe that's why storms often appeared when anyone tried to approach. For most, the island was just a story. But for one man, it became an obsession. He was a journalist who had spent years chasing real-life mysteries. He had seen a lot in his career: hidden villages, lost ships, strange towns. But something about this island felt different. He first heard about it while reading a forgotten report about a cargo ship that vanished near the area 10 years ago. The ship had been carrying scientific equipment and supplies, and it disappeared without sending a single distress signal. No wreckage was ever found. At first, the journalist didn't think much of it. Ships disappeared at sea all the time, but when he looked deeper, he found that the island had once been marked on government maps as a restricted zone. There were no records explaining why. The restriction had quietly expired years ago, but no one seemed to have gone there since. That silence made him curious. He started digging through old archives and coastal records, looking for anything about the place. Most of the files had been removed or labeled confidential. A few fragments remained: an old report about research activity and a line mentioning environmental instability. That was all. Nothing else explained what kind of research had taken place or why it had been stopped. The more he searched, the more questions he found. What kind of research could be so secret that it required hiding an entire island? Why had it been abandoned so suddenly? And what happened to the people who once worked there? After weeks of searching, he decided he couldn't just read about it. He had to see it for himself. He gathered a small crew, a cameraman, a local fisherman who agreed to be their guide, and a boat operator who knew the ocean currents well. They packed light: a few days' worth of food, cameras, notebooks, and survival gear. The weather forecast showed clear skies, so they decided to leave at dawn. The sea was calm at first. The sunlight danced on the surface like liquid gold. The guide tried to keep everyone relaxed by sharing old stories, but his tone changed when the island came into view. From a distance, it looked like a green jewel floating in the water, surrounded by mist. But as they got closer, the air grew heavy, and the wind seemed to stop moving. The temperature dropped slightly, even though the sun was still shining above them. The boat slowed down as they neared the shore. The beach looked untouched, almost perfect. No footprints, no broken shells, no signs of life. The trees stood tall and straight, too straight, as if they'd been planted in careful rows. The journalist looked around, trying to spot any movement, but the island was completely still. It felt like time had stopped there. They stepped onto the sand, their shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground. The silence was strange. Even the waves seemed quieter than usual. The cameraman started recording while the journalist took notes. They found old crates half buried near the tree line, their wooden sides worn out by the weather. The symbols on them were faded, but one was still clear enough to read: a government seal, almost erased by salt and time. Inside one of the crates were bits of rusted metal, broken glass tubes, and a small sign that read, "Property of Coastal Research Division." None of them had ever heard of that department. The guide muttered something under his breath, saying it was better not to touch anything. The group moved deeper into the island, cutting through vines and thick bushes. The deeper they went, the stranger things felt. The trees looked too healthy, their leaves a deeper green than normal. The air smelled faintly of metal, mixed with the scent of wet soil. They found more traces of human presence: a collapsed wooden hut, empty cans, and what looked like old power cables buried in the ground. But everything seemed at least a decade old. As the sun began to set, the island changed color. The golden light made the trees glow and the shadows stretched across the sand. They decided to camp near the beach for the night. The cameraman set up his equipment to capture the view. while the journalist sat by the campfire reading through his notes. The guide quietly watched the water, as if expecting something to rise from it. That night, the silence broke for the first time. It started faintly, a low humming sound that came from somewhere deep within the island. It wasn't wind and it wasn't an animal. It was steady, mechanical, like a machine buried underground. The sound came and went in short bursts, almost rhythmic. The group looked at each other, unsure whether to investigate or wait till morning. The journalist decided to stay awake and record the sounds. He held his microphone toward the trees, trying to capture it. The guide warned him softly, saying the sound had been heard before, by fishermen who never came back. The journalist didn't respond. He was too focused. The sound grew slightly louder for a moment, then stopped completely, leaving behind an even heavier silence than before. The next morning, they woke up early and noticed something strange. Footprints, if not theirs, appeared near the edge of their camp. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there the day before. They looked human but lighter, as if someone had walked barefoot on soft ground. The trail led toward the forest, then disappeared among the roots and fallen leaves. The cameraman wanted to follow them, but the guide refused, saying it was dangerous to go too deep without knowing the terrain. The journalist, however, couldn't ignore it. He convinced the others to go just a little further. They followed the direction of the footprints, walking quietly through the trees. After a few minutes, they found an old fence made of rusted wire and metal posts, half swallowed by plants. Behind it was a broken sign. Only one word was still readable: facility. The journalist froze. This was the first real proof that something once operated here. He filmed the sign, then climbed over the fence. The ground beyond it was covered in fragments of metal, pieces of glass, and what looked like panels from machines. In the middle of it all stood a large concrete door built into the hillside, covered by moss and vines. It looked like an entrance to something underground. The door had no handle or lock, just a faint outline and a small circular marking near its edge. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The cameraman touched it gently. It was cold, almost icy, even in the tropical heat. The journalist took a deep breath, realizing they had found something big. Whatever this island had been hiding for a decade, it was behind that door. They decided to stop there for the day and return with better equipment the next morning. As they walked back to camp, the sky began to darken and the sound returned again. The same low, rhythmic hum, only this time, it was louder. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate slightly with each pulse of sound. When they reached the shore, they found the waves had grown restless. The once calm sea now carried small circular ripples spreading outward from the island, as if something beneath the water had stirred. The guide said quietly that they needed to leave, but the journalist shook his head. He had come too far to turn back now. That night, no one slept. The humming continued on and off, echoing through the trees. The journalist sat awake, staring at the outline of the forest, feeling that the island was watching them. He didn't know what was waiting behind that concrete door. But one thing was certain: this place wasn't empty. The island, silent for so many years, had started to breathe again. The morning came slowly, hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The sea looked dull and heavy, its waves barely moving. The small crew woke up tired, having barely slept through the night. The humming sound that had filled the air for hours had finally stopped before dawn, but it left a strange feeling behind, like the island was holding its breath. The journalist sat quietly near the edge of the beach, staring at the trees. The others were packing up their gear, speaking in low voices. Everyone could feel something wasn't right, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. The cameraman broke the silence by asking what their next step was. The journalist pointed toward the forest in the direction of the concrete door they had found yesterday. He said they needed to go back and open it. The guide hesitated. He said he had grown up hearing stories about the island, about people who went missing near it. He had taken the job thinking it would be just another story for tourists, but now his instincts told him to leave. The journalist tried to reason with him, saying this could be a discovery that changed everything. The guide looked down, shook his head, and said quietly that some secrets were better left alone. But curiosity is stronger than fear. After a few minutes, the guide agreed to take them back. Just one more time, he said. They packed their bags again, checked their cameras and flashlights, and began walking toward the forest. The path felt different that morning. The air was heavier, and the forest seemed darker even though the sun had risen. The birds that usually filled the air with noise were nowhere to be heard. The journalist noticed small patches on the trees where the bark looked melted or burned, as if touched by heat. When he brushed his hand against one, it was warm. They reached the rusted fence again and climbed over. The concrete door looked just as they had left it, covered in moss and vines, but now there was a faint smell coming from it, metallic and damp. The cameraman took out a small metal rod to pry at the edge. To their surprise, the door wasn't locked. It moved slightly when he pushed. The journalist joined him, and together they forced it open enough to slip through. A cool draft rushed out, carrying the scent of old air that had been trapped for years. Inside, the passage was dark, silent, and colder than the outside. The journalist turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through dust and cobwebs. The walls were made of smooth concrete, and metal pipes ran along the ceiling. They stepped inside carefully. The floor was covered in dirt and fallen debris, but the deeper they went, the cleaner it became. It felt like the underground facility had been sealed in time. After walking for several minutes, they reached a wide room filled with broken equipment. Tables, computers, and glass containers were scattered everywhere. On one wall hung a large torn map of the island with markings in red ink. The cameraman began recording everything while the journalist studied the papers on the floor. Most were unreadable, ruined by moisture, but one sheet caught his attention. It had a date, 10 years ago, and a title that read Energy, Stabilization Project. Below, it were strange diagrams and a signature from someone working for the Marine Energy Department. None of them had ever heard of such a division. As they looked around, the guide stood near the entrance, refusing to go further inside. His eyes kept moving toward the shadows. He said he could hear something faint, like whispers or the sound of movement from somewhere deeper in the tunnels. The others listened but heard nothing. The journalist told him it was probably just the echo of their own voices. But deep down, he wasn't sure. They decided to explore the next corridor. The walls there were lined with glass chambers, some broken, some still sealed. Inside a few, they could see traces of green residue clinging to the glass, glowing faintly even without light. The cameraman filmed it closely, fascinated by the strange glow. The journalist picked up a small shard of glass and noticed the residue felt slightly warm. At the end of the hallway, they found a control room. Dust covered the panels, but a few screens were still intact. There were handwritten notes taped to one of them. The words were faded, but they could still make out phrases like containment breach and core unstable. Suddenly, the guide called out from behind them. His flashlight was shaking slightly as he pointed it at the floor. There were footprints, fresh ones, leading deeper into the tunnels. The prints were small, maybe from bare feet. The journalist crouched down and touched one. It was damp and recent. Someone, or something, had been there. A chill ran through the group. The cameraman whispered that they should go back, but the journalist insisted on following the trail. They moved slowly, every sound amplified by the hollow tunnels. The footprints led them to a wide chamber filled with metal tanks and wires. In the middle stood a large cylindrical container with cracks running down its side. Inside, they could still see a faint green light pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The cameraman filmed it, whispering that it looked alive. The journalist moved closer, brushing away dust from a nearby control panel. A small metal tag was attached to it, reading Bioenergy Core Prototype. Next to it was another paper, half-burned, describing the experiment. It spoke about using bioluminescent algae to generate clean power from ocean water. The process had been successful at first, but soon became unstable, leading to unexpected biological reactions. The journalist read the words out loud, feeling a growing unease. He looked at the glowing substance inside the container. It shimmered as if it could hear them. The cameraman zoomed in, capturing the eerie green light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their breathing. Then came the sound again, the same humming they had heard at night, only louder, echoing through the tunnels. The ground beneath them vibrated lightly. The guide shouted that they needed to leave, but the journalist hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. The humming continued, steady and strong, coming from beneath the floor. They turned to leave, moving quickly down the corridor, but as they reached the main room, something caught the cameraman's eye. A row of photos pinned to a board near the entrance. The pictures showed a group of scientists standing near the same container they had just seen. smiling proudly. But the last photo was different. It showed the same room in chaos, papers flying, alarms flashing, and one scientist pointing toward the door in panic. That image made their hearts race. They didn't wait any longer. They ran out of the tunnel and back into the sunlight. When they stepped outside, the air felt hot and heavy, as if the island itself had woken up. The guide looked at the sky. The clouds were moving fast, forming a circle above the island. The sound was still faintly audible beneath their feet, spreading through the ground like a slow vibration. They hurried back to their camp by the beach. The journalist sat down, breathing hard, his mind racing. He had come looking for answers, but now had more questions than ever. Who were those scientists? What happened during that last experiment? And if the energy core was still active after all these years, what was keeping it alive? That night, they tried to send their footage through the satellite connection on their equipment, but the signal kept cutting out. The devices worked fine earlier, yet now they couldn't stay connected for more than a few seconds. The cameraman joked nervously that maybe the island didn't want its secret to leave. No one laughed. As the night deepened, they saw faint green lights flickering in the forest, the same glow as the residue inside the tunnels. It wasn't fireflies. It was too bright, too controlled. The lights moved slowly, almost in patterns, as if something was moving beneath the ground, tracing lines under the soil. The guide said he was leaving at sunrise, with or without them. The journalist nodded, but said he needed just one more day to collect evidence. He felt an invisible pull toward that underground door, as if the island itself was daring him to come back. Later, while everyone tried to rest, the journalist sat near the water again, staring at the reflection of the glowing forest in the waves. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't discovered the real secret yet, that the tunnel was only the surface of something far deeper. The wind picked up, and the faint humming returned once more, rolling across the beach like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The island wasn't done with them yet. The morning sun rose weakly through the fog, painting the island in a pale gray light. The air smelled strange, like salt mixed with metal. The journalist woke up early, unable to sleep after the night's events. The green glow in the forest had finally faded, but the memory of it still lingered in his mind. He kept replaying the images they'd recorded, the cracked container, the pulsing light, the strange footprints. None of it made sense, but he knew they had found something important. The guide stood near the boat, ready to leave. His eyes were tired, his voice firm. He said he had helped enough and didn't want to be part of this anymore. The sea, he said, was changing. He could feel it. The journalist tried to convince him to stay one more day, promising it would be the last, but the guide refused. He pointed toward the horizon where thick clouds were gathering again. "The island doesn't want us here," he said quietly, then began loading his bag onto the boat. The cameraman looked uneasy but didn't speak. He knew the journalist wouldn't give up so easily. After some silence, he finally said they could go back to the underground site just once more, to take one last video, maybe find out what caused the humming sound. The journalist agreed quickly. Deep inside, he felt that if they left now, he would never forgive himself. They packed their cameras, flashlights, and a few tools, then began their walk back toward the forest. The ground felt softer than before, almost spongy in some places. When they stepped, it made a faint squishing sound, as if the earth itself was breathing. The cameraman noticed the trees looked different too. Their roots seemed to twist above the ground, glowing faintly with green veins that pulsed slowly like blood under skin. The journalist filmed everything, his hands shaking slightly. He whispered that maybe the island had absorbed some of the energy from the experiment. Maybe that was why the plants seemed alive in a strange way. The cameraman didn't answer. He just kept walking, his camera focused on the glowing roots. They reached the old concrete door again. It stood slightly open now, as if someone had pushed it during the night. The journalist frowned. They had closed it tightly when they left. He looked around but saw no signs of anyone nearby. The air coming from the tunnel was colder than before, carrying a faint humming vibration. They stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a scent of old metal and sea salt. The corridor looked the same, but there was one thing different. The glowing residue on the glass chambers had grown brighter. Some of the glass even looked freshly wet, as if the green substance was alive and spreading. They moved deeper into the facility, past the control room and down the main hallway. The hum grew louder with every step, deep and steady like a slow heartbeat echoing through the walls. The journalist followed the sound until they reached a new area they hadn't explored before. A locked steel door marked Core Chamber. The paint was peeling, and rust covered the edges, but the door still looked strong. Next to it, they found a small panel with a cracked screen. The journalist brushed off the dust and saw faint writing on it. It said, "Do not open unstable containment." He hesitated, staring at it for a long moment. The cameraman whispered that maybe they should stop. But the journalist's curiosity was stronger than fear. He reached for the handle and pulled. The door resisted at first, then gave way with a loud metallic creak. A cold gust of air rushed out, smelling of chemicals and seawater. Inside the chamber was enormous. The ceiling rose high above them, covered in pipes and cables. In the center stood a massive structure made of glass and steel, the true energy core. It was cracked in several places, glowing brighter than before. The green light inside pulsed steadily, illuminating the entire room in an eerie glow. They walked closer, filming everything. The walls of the chamber were covered in strange coral-like growths that seemed to crawl across the metal. The green light from the core reflected on their faces, giving them a ghostly look. The cameraman said softly that it almost felt like the island was alive, that it was watching them. The journalist didn't respond. He was staring at something near the base of the core, an old journal half buried under debris. He picked it up carefully. The cover was torn, but the pages were still legible. It seemed to belong to one of the scientists who had worked there. The first entries described excitement and progress. They had discovered a way to use algae found in deep-sea vents to generate endless power. The algae could absorb sunlight and salt water to produce energy. The team believed it could change the world. But as the entries continued, the tone shifted. Words like mutation, uncontrolled growth, and containment failure appeared more often. The last few pages were rushed and shaky. One of them said, "It's not dying and it's adapting. The island is changing." The final line read, "We sealed the door. May no one ever open it again." The journalist felt a chill run through him. He looked at the core again. The cracks had widened slightly, and tiny bubbles of green light were escaping into the air, floating like sparks. The cameraman whispered for him to leave it alone, but the journalist couldn't stop staring. He stepped closer, reaching out as if drawn to it. Suddenly, the humming deepened, turning into a loud vibration that shook the floor. The lights in their flashlights flickered. The cameraman grabbed the journalist's arm, pulling him back. The ground beneath the core began to glow, and a stream of green light shot up through the cracks, spreading along the ceiling pipes like veins of fire. The journalist shouted for them to run. They sprinted toward the exit as pieces of metal and concrete fell around them. The hum grew so loud it felt like it was coming from inside their heads. When they reached the main corridor, they could see the green light spreading through the walls, moving like liquid. It wasn't just energy. It was alive, flowing through the tunnels as if reclaiming what was once its own. They burst out of the concrete door and into the sunlight, gasping for air. Behind them, the ground trembled slightly. The forest ahead glowed faintly, as if the energy had reached the surface. The cameraman dropped to the sand, shaking. He said they needed to leave now before it spread further. They ran toward the beach, calling out for the guide. The boat was still there, tied loosely to a rock, but the guide was gone. His footprints led toward the trees, then vanished. The journalist shouted his name, but there was no answer. Only the sound of waves and that deep, faint hum rolling beneath the island. They decided to wait near the boat, hoping the guide would return. The cameraman checked the footage. Everything had been captured, even the moment the core cracked open. The video looked unreal, like something from another world. The journalist stared at the screen silently, realizing the importance of what they had found. But he also felt something else. Fear. As evening fell, the ocean around the island began to glow faintly with the same green light. It shimmered under the water, spreading out in slow waves. The cameraman whispered that maybe the energy had leaked into the sea. The journalist said nothing. He could feel a vibration under his feet again, faint but steady. They stayed awake through the night, unable to sleep. The stars above them flickered, half hidden by clouds. The hum continued in a slow rhythm, matching the pulse of the glowing ocean. The journalist looked out over the water and realized the island wasn't just hiding a secret. It was becoming something new. When morning came, the boat operator who had stayed offshore returned, looking pale and frightened. He said he had seen lights under the water during the night, moving in circles around the island like a living thing. He begged them to leave before the tide turned. The journalist agreed. They packed their things quickly and pushed the boat into the water. As they sailed away, the island grew smaller behind them, the glow still faintly visible through the mist. The journalist kept filming, unable to look away. After an hour at sea, the humming faded. The air grew lighter and the waves returned to normal. But none of them spoke. They all knew what they had seen wasn't over. The journalist sat quietly with the camera in his lap, staring back at the island disappearing into the fog. He thought about the journal he had read, about the line that said the island was changing. Maybe it wasn't a warning. Maybe it was the truth. The island wasn't dying. It was alive. And now that they had opened the door, it had woken up for good. The sea was calm when they finally left the island behind, but the calm didn't bring peace. The journalist sat quietly in the small boat staring at the waves. The cameraman sat beside him, holding the camera close as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The boat operator said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the water, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. None of them spoke about what they had seen. The memory was too fresh, too heavy to put into words. The island faded slowly into the fog until it was gone, just a shadow swallowed by mist. Yet even as it disappeared, they could still see the faint green glow under the water, following them like a reflection. The journalist tried to convince himself it was only sunlight, but deep down he knew better. Something from that island wasn't finished with them yet. Hours passed before they reached the nearest coastal town. It was small, quiet, and surrounded by thick palm trees. They docked the boat near an old wooden pier. The operator refused to go any further. He said he needed to clean the boat before the tide changed, his voice trembling slightly. The cameraman helped unload the equipment while the journalist carried the camera bag tightly against his chest, as if it contained something precious. They checked into a small guest house near the beach. The owner was friendly but curious. She asked where they had come from, and when the journalist mentioned the island, her expression changed immediately. She didn't ask any more questions. That silence told them enough. The locals knew the stories. Inside their room, the journalist played back the footage. The camera had recorded everything: the tunnels, the broken glass chambers, the glowing residue, and finally, the core itself cracking open. The sound of the humming filled the room again. Even though they were far from the island, it made their skin crawl. The cameraman said softly that they should send the footage to the mainland authorities. Maybe scientists there could explain what they saw. But before they could decide, the power in the room flickered. The light bulb above them dimmed for a moment, then returned to normal. The journalist froze. He looked at the camera. It was still on, but the screen showed static for a few seconds before clearing again. The cameraman brushed it off, saying it was just bad electricity, but the journalist couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it was connected to what they had brought back. The next morning, the cameraman went down to the beach to talk to some fishermen about sending their equipment on a cargo ship. The journalist stayed in the room, writing down everything that had happened, from the first day they landed on the island to the moment they escaped. He wanted the story to be told clearly with proof, before anyone could silence it. But as he wrote, something strange caught his attention. The walls near the window had tiny patches of green light, barely visible like small glowing dots. He leaned closer. They weren't reflections. They were growing inside the cracks of the old wooden frame. He stepped back quickly, his heart pounding. It couldn't be possible. They were miles away from the island. When the cameraman returned, the journalist showed him the glowing spots. The cameraman looked shocked but tried to stay calm. He said maybe it was just some kind of fungus reacting to humidity. But even as he said it, the glow grew slightly brighter, as if it heard them. They both stared in silence, realizing that the same light from the island had followed them. Here. That night, they decided to check their boat again. Maybe something had come with them, something they didn't notice when they left. They walked down the quiet streets to the pier. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight. Their boat was tied gently to the dock, rocking in the tide. The operator wasn't there. His small shack nearby was dark. The cameraman climbed aboard first, shining his flashlight across the deck. Everything looked normal at first, but when he lifted one of the storage covers, he froze. The inside was damp and faintly glowing green. The same residue from the island was spread across the floor in thin streaks like veins. The journalist stared at it in disbelief. It had survived the journey. He took out a small glass jar from his bag and carefully scraped a bit of the glowing substance into it, sealing the lid tight. The cameraman protested, saying it was dangerous, but the journalist said they needed proof. Something real to show what was happening. He sealed the jar inside a plastic box and wrapped it twice. As they were about to leave, a loud splash came from behind the boat. The cameraman pointed his flashlight toward the water, but there was nothing, only ripples spreading across the surface. Then, for a split second, they saw it. Something glowing under the water, moving slowly, almost like a current alive with light. It circled beneath them once, then disappeared into the darkness. They ran back to the guest house without looking back. Neither of them slept that night. The journalist kept the jar on the table, watching the green light flicker softly inside, like a heartbeat. He wrote more notes describing everything they saw, his handwriting shaky but fast. The next day the power went out again, this time across the whole town. The locals gathered outside talking nervously. Some said it was the storm approaching, others whispered that it was the ocean again. The journalist looked toward the horizon. The sky above the island was covered in dark clouds, flashing faintly with green light even in daylight. He realized the energy wasn't just alive. It was spreading. They packed their things and decided to head to the mainland by evening ferry. The cameraman said they could deliver the footage and the jar directly to the authorities, maybe even news channels. It was time to let the world know. But before they could leave, they went to the pier one last time to find the boat operator. His shack was still empty. The door was half open. Inside, the walls were damp and faint green trails marked the floor, leading toward the back. The journalist followed them slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Behind the shack, near the rocks, they found his shoes and a set of footprints leading straight into the water, glowing faintly before fading into the sea. There was no sign of him anywhere. The cameraman turned pale. He wanted to leave immediately. They hurried to the ferry station, carrying only the essentials, the camera, the jar, and the written notes. The ferry was small, with only a handful of passengers. As it pulled away from the dock, the journalist looked back one last time. The town was quiet, but he could see faint lights spreading through the water near the shore. The ride was rough. The sea grew choppy halfway through the journey. The captain said the weather had turned strange. No wind, just heavy air and rising waves. The journalist tried to send an email using the ship's radio connection, attaching a short clip from their footage, but the signal kept failing. When he finally got it to send, the screen glitched, freezing on a single frame, the glowing core deep inside the island. Then the lights on the ferry flickered. For a few seconds, everything went dark. The passengers whispered nervously. When the lights returned, one of the crew members said the engine had slowed down for no reason. They checked the machinery but couldn't find any fault. The journalist glanced over the side and saw a faint green shimmer under the water again, following the ship. He grabbed the jar from his bag and stared at it. The light inside was brighter than before, pulsing faster, almost in sync with the waves. The cameraman whispered that maybe it was reacting to something, maybe to the island calling it back. The journalist didn't know what to think. He just knew that whatever they had found, it wasn't just energy. It was something living. By the time they reached the mainland, the glow had faded again. The ferry docked safely, but the captain refused to go near that route again. He said the sea had felt wrong. The journalist and the cameraman stepped onto solid ground, exhausted but determined. They carried the camera and the jar carefully, heading straight for the city. That night, in a small rented apartment, the journalist uploaded the footage to multiple servers. He backed it up in 3 places, making sure it couldn't be lost. He knew people would call it fake, but once they analyzed the footage, they would see the truth. The cameraman sat by the window, staring at the jar on the table. The green light inside had dimmed, but still glowed faintly, as if waiting. The journalist looked out the window at the distant sea. The horizon shimmered faintly in the dark. He thought about the journal he had found, about how the scientists had said it wasn't dying, it was adapting. He wondered if, by opening that door, they had given it a way to spread beyond the island, Somewhere out there, in the middle of the ocean, that small island was still glowing, brighter each night. And now, miles away, a tiny piece of it was sitting in a glass jar on a table, quietly pulsing, alive and waiting. The journalist didn't know what would happen next. But deep inside he feared that the secret of that island was no longer hidden. It was already moving, already growing. The decade-old mystery had awakened, and the world was about to feel its heartbeat. The night in the city was calm, but the air felt heavier than usual. The journalist sat by the window staring at the small jar on the table. The green light inside had dimmed, but every few seconds it flickered softly like a heartbeat. The cameraman was asleep on the couch, his laptop still open beside him, showing frames from the footage they'd captured on the island. Every time the screen refreshed, the image seemed to move a little, even though the video was paused. The journalist rubbed his tired eyes. He hadn't slept properly in days. The sounds of cars and distant voices from the street below filled the room, but he felt strangely disconnected from it all. He kept thinking about the island, how peaceful it had looked from afar, and how different it truly was once they stepped foot on it. He picked up the jar again, holding it carefully in both hands. The glass was warm, almost as if it were alive. He could see small bubbles moving slowly inside, swirling like tiny stars. He set it back down and opened his notebook, reading through his notes. He wanted to finish the article before morning. He needed people to know what they had discovered. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. He froze for a moment, unsure if he had imagined it. Then came another knock, slightly louder. The cameraman woke up, rubbing his eyes. "Who's that at this hour?" he muttered. The journalist didn't answer. He walked quietly to the door and asked who it was. A man's voice replied from the other side. He said he was from the local port authority and wanted to ask questions about their trip from the island. The journalist hesitated, but then unlocked the door halfway. The man stood there wearing a dark raincoat. He looked calm but tired, as if he hadn't slept either. He asked politely if they were the ones who had come in from the coastal town 2 nights ago. The journalist nodded. The man said some fishermen had reported strange glowing water near the docks that morning. He asked if they had seen anything unusual during their trip. The cameraman shot a nervous glance at the jar on the table, but the journalist calmly said they had only seen rough weather and nothing else. The man nodded slowly. "If you remember anything else," he said, "please contact us." He handed over a card and left down the hall. The journalist closed the door quickly and locked it again. For a long moment they stood in silence, listening to the fading sound of footsteps. The cameraman spoke first. "We can't hide this much longer," he said quietly. "If people are seeing the glow, it's already spreading." The journalist agreed, but told him they needed to be careful. If the story got out the wrong way, people would panic, or worse, powerful people would try to cover it up. The next morning, the city was buzzing with strange news. Reports were spreading online about glowing patches appearing in coastal waters along several towns. Some people called it pollution. Others said it was an algae bloom, but the journalist knew better. It was the same energy, the same light from that island. He decided to go to a nearby research center. He wrapped the jar carefully in a cloth and carried it in a small bag. The cameraman stayed behind to edit the footage. As the journalist walked through the crowded streets, he noticed people talking about the strange glow, showing photos on their phones. A few even mentioned feeling tingling sensations after touching the water near the shore. When he reached the research center, a young scientist greeted him at the front desk. She looked curious when he explained that he wanted to speak to someone about a biological sample. After a short wait, he was led into a small lab. The scientist asked what kind of sample he had brought. He placed the jar gently on the table. The green light shimmered faintly inside. For a moment, she looked amazed. "That's beautiful," she said softly, then asked what it was. The journalist told her the short version, that it came from a remote island where strange experiments had once taken place. He didn't mention the full truth yet. She put on gloves and examined the jar carefully. "It doesn't look like any known bioluminescent organism," she said. "If this is alive, it's something new." She asked if she could take a small sample to analyze. The journalist agreed, but only under the condition that it wouldn't leave the lab. She drew a tiny amount into a tube and placed it under a microscope. For several minutes she said nothing, only adjusting the focus and changing lenses. Then she leaned back slowly, her face pale. "It's moving," she whispered. "The cells. They're multiplying." The journalist felt a chill run down his spine. She looked up at him. "It's reacting to light and temperature," she said. "It's adapting itself." She turned to him with serious eyes. "Where did you really find this?" He hesitated, then told her everything. About the island, the abandoned lab, the glowing core, the escape. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said quietly, "You might have brought back something far more dangerous than you realize." She suggested calling the National Environmental Agency immediately. But before she could make the call, the lights in the lab flickered, just like they had on the island. The machines beeped and the power dipped for a moment. When it came back, the small test tube on the table was glowing brighter than before. The scientist quickly sealed it inside a containment box. "We need to move this," she said urgently. "It's reacting to the power source." The journalist helped her pack the sample while she called her supervisor. They moved everything to a backup lab powered by a separate generator. Meanwhile, the cameraman called the journalist's phone. His voice was panicked. "You need to come back right now," he said. The jar had cracked. The journalist's heart dropped. He told the scientist he had to go and ran out of the building. By the time he reached the apartment, the cameraman had sealed the cracked jar inside a metal container. "It started shaking," he said breathlessly. Then it made this low humming sound, like it was alive. The journalist looked inside the container. The green glow was faint now, but it pulsed softly as if sleeping. He didn't know what to do. The scientist's words echoed in his mind. "It's adapting." That night, the storm finally hit the city. Heavy rain poured down. Lightning flashed over the sea and thunder shook the buildings. The cameraman was busy uploading the final version of their footage. "If anything happens," he said, "people will have proof." The journalist sat near the window watching the rain fall. Then he saw something that made his breath stop. The sea beyond the harbor was glowing, not just in patches but across the entire surface. Lines of light were spreading through the waves, moving like veins of living energy. He turned on the TV. Every news channel was showing the same thing: glowing seas, strange power surges, and reports of small fish washing ashore covered in faint green patterns. Scientists were calling it a natural phenomenon, but he knew it wasn't. It was spreading faster than anyone could imagine. By dawn, the glow reached the edges of the harbor. The city's power grid flickered again. The journalist and the cameraman decided to leave for the inland region, where the research center was located. They packed their belongings and sealed the metal container inside a cooler box. The streets were crowded with people watching the sea. Some were taking pictures, others praying quietly. The glow was strangely beautiful, like a moving aurora across the water. But underneath that beauty, there was something unsettling. It felt alive. As they drove out of the city, the journalist kept checking the box beside him. The glow inside was steady now, not fading anymore. It seemed almost calm, as if it had found a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the world around it. When they reached the outskirts, they stopped by a hill overlooking the sea. From there, they could see the full view, the coastline lit up in green, stretching endlessly. The cameraman filmed it in silence. The journalist stood still for a long time, watching. He realized the truth. Maybe the island hadn't been a prison for the energy. Maybe it had been its birthplace. The people who worked there tried to contain it, but nature always finds a way to escape. He thought of the scientist's words. It's adapting. Maybe this was the next step, something the world wasn't ready for but couldn't stop. The light wasn't destroying. It was spreading, finding balance in a world that had long lost it. The cameraman lowered his camera. "Do you think this is the end?" he asked quietly. The journalist shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It's just the beginning." He looked at the horizon again. The first light of morning was breaking through the clouds, mixing with the green glow of the sea. It was a strange, haunting beauty, the kind that marked the start of something unknown. And in that moment, standing there with the sea breathing softly below, the journalist understood that the story he had been chasing wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. A future that was already alive, growing quietly, waiting to be discovered.